So I grew up very shy and introverted. So I couldn't talk with people, words could not come out. And the way that I got over it is just realizing that most people don't care. Fear often stops us doing things. If you refer to it as experimenting, that changes the perspective completely, because in experiment, we expect it to fail. And I think if we use the same approach to our life, actually we'll just remove some of that pressure.
Giorgia, thank you very much for joining me on Success Matters podcast. You've been on quite a journey in terms of your upbringing, the whole different working in lots of different countries and lots of different cultural experiences. So let's start with actually your growing up in a small town or small village in Italy. How was that? Where was that? What was life like then?
Oh, it was very different. But first of all, thanks for having me on your podcast today. So it was a village. It was a small village in kind of a part of Italy that's not on the tourist route. So it felt very small, and I always had this desire, this understanding that there was a big world out there, and I just felt really constrained living there. And I guess one of the things for me, I was an avid reader. Since I was about 8 or 9, I started reading a lot, one book after the other. And that just opened my eyes to, oh, there's a whole world out there, different experiences, different cultures. So I always had it in me that probably I would move out at some point. And I think as soon as I finished high school, I decided to come to London for the first time, and it was as you may expect, very very different. Suddenly I was in a metropolis with lots of people, and I think to me was also there's something as part of my experience that was really important. So I grew up very shy and introverted.
Right.
So I couldn't talk with people, words could not come out, even if I wanted to. And it was just this situation really added to the desire to move somewhere else, to kind of start anew, just experimenting with who I was or who I really was, because I didn't feel this shy girl. And I think the opportunity of moving to a different place is a really good time to experiment.
Mm.
You actually do make a couple of moves because it takes practice. You can't go immediately from really shy to just somebody who can talk with strangers.
Yeah.
But that was part of my journey.
So you left a small village
Mm.
in Italy, came to London. That's quite a massive change to make, as you say, both in terms of just as being in this big metropolis, noisy, lots of people, lots of vehicles, lots of this and everything else. And on top of that, your shyness. So did you speak English when you came, or did you have to learn English as you came
Yeah.
over?
Well, I studied at school,
Hmm.
but really you can't talk
Yeah.
with what you learn at school. It's just those sentences. And people that have this habit of reply something that you're not familiar from the books.
Yes.
So it took a lot of effort at the beginning, but to me it was very adventurous. I mean, I did some waitressing, and then I was an au pair. So all jobs where you know you can learn as you go along without just the pressure of having a serious job.
How did you overcome that shyness though? Because I'm mindful that you land in a foreign country, a country that you're not familiar with, and that shyness can kick in to the extent that you just kind of get withdrawn and don't interact with many people, particularly when there's a language barrier as well. So how did you overcome that?
Yeah, I think I look at it in a different way because nobody knew I was shy. All the new people that I met, it was, oh, I was a new person. So, in a way, you can just sort of start creating or start building who you really are
Right.
because there's no expectations. While if you grow up, your friends, your parents, relatives, everybody knows that you're shy. So that there is just a barrier to overcome, which I find it much greater than if you are in a new environment.
Yeah, it's interesting actually that it gives you that opportunity to kind of close one perspective or take off a label that other people maybe have put on you and create your own new reality, which is really important. So you came to London, you worked, you studied, and then you got a job that took you to many different countries.
Yeah, I mean, it took, a few other steps,
Yeah.
after living in London. I thought like the bug, so I went to live in Spain for 2.5 years.
Okay.
And then I went back to London. I did a couple of jobs. And then I realized that people who had interesting jobs, they tended to have a degree.
Right.
So I said, okay, yeah, maybe it's time to study. I was not really good at school when I was in Italy, so it was just another big step.
Uh-huh.
And after that, I got a first job that I started traveling around Europe for work. And in terms of other destinations, a few years afterwards, it was ended up in Australia for 1 year. I had a project in Cairo, so I lived there and worked there for 6 months, with lots of other travel in between. And
Right.
so, what I desired as a kid, which is, travel a lot, actually, I just got to realize that.
That's like a dream come true, right? And a real opportunity. How did you find the contrast in working in Australia versus Cairo versus I know you also mentioned Kazakhstan in when we were preparing for this. How were things different in each of these countries?
I think, and that was comes my, things that I learned. For example, my when I did my MBA, the thesis was on cultural diversity. So I had the opportunity of do a lot of reading to understand, different cultures. And one of the things, and it's in my book as well about Australia, is what they call tall poppies. And I don't know if you come across, but essentially it's a very qualitarian society at work as well.
Right,
So, they don't like people who stand up too much, stand out. And being called a tall poppy is not a good thing because it's a bit like a show off.
right.
Somebody that wants to be above others. And I realized that that's the label that they gave me
Okay, you were a
because I
tall
was there.
poppy in Australia.
I know.
Right.
It was no good thing, I was, but at the same time, to me, I was a consultant. As a consultant, you're expected to have opinions.
Yes.
You're expected to give advice. You're expected to know a little bit more because otherwise, you know, that's the job, how you contribute. And so I started noticing people that were looking at me a bit funny. And then a very kind, one of my change managers in the team on the client side, she took me on the side and she said, "Oh, I think you never heard of this expression. Let's talk about it." And there was a really good learning because I didn't know about it.
Mhm.
So now I was behaving in a way that was just causing some friction with the client. And to me, it's one of the lessons of really understanding the local culture.
Mhm.
So you're sure that you don't make, I mean, unwilling mistakes.
Mm, absolutely. So that that sort of cultural aspect in as you were just talking, I'm thinking here's a shy girl who's now become a tall poppy in Australia. That's quite a contrast,
I
isn't
didn't think of that one before.
it? That's like, okay, how did that happen? And how was working in Egypt compared to Australia or the UK?
It was very interesting. So it was also the second year of the revolution. So
Hmm.
the situation was quite tense. And so sometimes we were told, "Oh, you can't leave the hotel at the weekend, it's dangerous." So, and I think it just gives to the sense of mystique and my sense of
Yeah.
adventure as well. I think that the dynamics are very different. There's something that you have to be very cautious of.
Hmm.
How, men and women, they just sort of relate to each other. You have to be more careful what you wear and how you come across. So those are the things that, um, I've learned to, consider. again, to me, is about being, part of a group. So, sometimes you push the boundaries a little bit, especially as a consultant, but it just is about being respectful. And I think what I learned from Egypt is just this, the importance of, managing the relationships and, sensitivities that you have across, different cultures.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. That's so you mentioned your book. You've got your book in the background there, Master the Change Maze. Um, what's the book about, and what brought you to writing the book?
The book is about change management, and is a book for leaders who are in charge or responsible for a change or a transformation in their organization. And is my ethos as well. How do you prevent chaos happening?
Okay.
And I talk about all the things that I learned throughout my career. How do you make sure that you have a clear purpose for the change? You're aligned across the leadership team, you identify blind spots, all those things that possibly can go wrong, but sometimes we discover it when it's too late.
Yeah.
And they all have an impact on the success and, make the change more expensive as well. Plus, of course, there's lots of, few chapters on behaviors and cultures and people and, some important lessons that I learned and I decided I wanted to share with the clients I was working with, and of course, and, try and reach a wider audience.
Hmm. So at the moment, we're going through a lot of change. If we think about the sort of geopolitical situation and um, economic situation and all those elements. So if there's a business leader listening to this, or actually someone who's just part of a corporation or an organization that's going through a lot of change, what would be the sort of top three things you would advise them to do in the context of all the changes happening around them?
I think first of all, I'm a big fan of really understanding the uncertainty and the blind spots. It's something that the more I was writing about it, the more I just got really interested. And these are all the things that we don't expect. It's like the black swan events.
Mhm.
And I think it's really important, and it is possible to identify and manage some of them in advance. So that's one of the, to me, big lessons. And I run, workshops, and I work with clients to identify those things. Second is people, and something that I notice, especially with some of the AI programs, they're too driven by technology.
Mhm.
And I think, the impact on people, on the organization is something that's really important to understand in advance.
Okay.
And number three, probably I would say try not to do too much. I think there's so much going on, as you said, in the organization or in the world, that we are tempted to just want to fix everything.
Mhm.
You start too many programs, too many initiatives, and it confuses people, and it just you don't understand what's the priority anymore. And sometimes you end up, spending too much time and money on something that's not important.
Hmm. Okay. They the the thing with a big corporation is it's like an oil tanker, isn't it? It takes a long
Mm.
time to turn. But if it doesn't turn, it's at the risk of being blindsided by all these other, smaller, faster, more agile organizations. So um, there's that balance, isn't there, which is really difficult to strike between the amount of change you bring, the amount of disruption you bring into a business versus the need for change and why you absolutely need to change to remain competitive in that marketplace. So it's an interesting thing you say to not try too much, whilst the instinct may be we should just throw everything in the air and, almost like a clean slate of paper to start with.
Yeah. It is, but it happens at a personal level as well.
Yeah.
I know, oh, there's just a book and I want to record videos and there's just so many things I want to do.
Mm.
And I know I have to rein myself in, just say, okay, what's the important thing to
Yeah.
do? What's the key goal for this quarter? And
Mhm.
making sure that everything else aligns to that.
Yeah, that's so true. Actually, in the personal life, we often think, okay, I must do this, I must do that, I must do that. Either none of it gets done, or some of it gets done, but not particularly well, or it's just, becomes just a dream that never happens. And one thing that I've started in 2026 is I start the week with what are the three things that I want to achieve this week? And
Yep.
that's the only thing I think about for the week, those three things. Because otherwise, my brain goes off all over the shop in different
Yep.
directions about everything else that I should be doing. So, yeah, that's a really good point. So, as you know, this podcast is called Success Matters. As you've been on this journey through life, how has your thoughts of success changed and what does success mean to you now?
It's a good question, especially reflecting through history, because I think it changes over time.
Mm.
And I think it's driven a lot by your environment and what you're doing. If I think back to just where I grew up, just not living in a small village, it was like success, I just
Yeah.
made it. I lived in a city. For me now, success, I relate it to independence,
Okay.
to being able to say, okay, if I want, I can go and spend 1 month working from a different country.
Hmm.
For example, a few years ago, I just spent most of the year working remotely. I had my clients which I could support while traveling around the world.
Hmm.
And I think to me success,
Yeah.
that freedom to explore different ways of doing things and see if they work for you or not.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. And when you were in that position where you were able to work from other countries while supporting your clients, um, what needed to be true for that to be able to take place?
What do you mean?
So someone listening to this might think, well, I could never do that because I don't have the money to be able to do that, or I don't have this, or I don't have that. So what would you say to someone thinking of that? What would they need as kind of like almost the bare minimum to have that sort of lifestyle?
I would say test it.
Hmm.
I think I tried it. I think the first one was just a trip. I think it was Paris and Brussels for 2 weeks.
Right.
Just say, okay, yeah, it's doable because then you work across Europe is not a big problem,
Yeah.
but you work across time zones. You need to adjust to all of those things, and you need to see if you can actually can do it with the type of work that you do. So to me, that was the test.
Hmm.
Just a couple of weeks, and then it was seems to work. And the thing is, if it doesn't work, you just come back.
Mm.
The
Yeah.
plan was not to spend most of the year away. We're just sort of planning a couple of months at a time,
Hmm.
and then just see, "Oh, yeah, it's still working. Let's continue." But it's a really good point because we fear often stops us doing things,
Mm. Yeah. That's
and most of the time it's just fear without any logic to it.
hmm yeah. That's the thing that holds us back, right? Fear is what holds us back, and fear of failure is the thing that holds most people back. And so, as you say, if it doesn't work out for you, you just come back, then you've learned a lesson, right? Whereas others
Yeah,
might say, "Oh, it didn't work out. I failed at that," and therefore feel bad about it, and yeah, put themselves down as a result of that.
yeah. I'm a big fan of language, so you can, if you refer to it as experimenting,
Mhm.
that changes the perspective completely because in experiment we expect it to fail. Especially in the tests that they do in medicine, in pharmaceutical, they keep testing things. IT sector the same. You have to keep testing a system, and you tweak it, and then one day it works. And I think if we use the same approach to our life, actually we'll just remove some of that pressure.
Yeah, that's a very true point. And my degree is in chemistry, so in chemistry you're always experimenting, and in, yeah, my final year was in the lab all the time with these experiments. So it's a really good point that um, treat it as an experiment, and the outcome that you perceive, good or bad, is different to treat it as, oh, I'm this big thing I'm going to do, and then it maybe doesn't work out how you thought, and you see it as a failure rather than, a like lesson learned. So yeah, that's a really good point in terms of wording.
And also something else that I learned, somebody told me, just treat it like data.
Hmm.
You're just learning, as in your experiment, you learn it. Okay, this works. This is the data that I got. This is how much I learned. And you just do it a little bit different next time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's so true. It is all just data. It's some sort of feedback, right? And nothing has meaning except the meaning that you give to it. So that's the thing. It's just there. It's something, and if you decide to look at it this way, then that's the meaning you're giving to it. If you look at it that way, it's a different meaning you're giving to it. So that's all there is. It is literally just data. So yeah,
Yep.
that's a good perspective. So I have a tradition in my podcast to ask a previous guest to ask a question for my next guest.
Mhm.
So my previous guest asked a question. I have to read it out because it's slightly long. Um, so my previous guest said, "What agreement did you make with yourself that you still hold on to, but which doesn't serve you now?"
Ooh. I think it goes back to fear. I think it just took a long time to let the fear go,
Hmm.
especially the one around what would people think.
Yes.
If you say the wrong word, or if you present something in a way that you think, oh, it's just not good enough. So I think that's it.
Mm.
And the way that I got over it is just realizing that most people don't care. We're also very we care about ourselves. We are very
Hmm.
self-centered as human beings. That's our behavior. Most of the time, people don't notice if you got something wrong.
Yeah. That's very true. I suppose the thing, and I was thinking maybe back to your shyness, is that sometimes, you do something as a kid that someone reacts to, and therefore then
Yeah.
that makes you shy, and that makes you scared of what reactions might be from other people if something happens. But actually, as you say, we're the 99% of the time, we're just too busy in ourselves to worry, to care about what other
Sure.
people are doing and up to. So, yeah, letting go of that is actually really important.
It is. I'm not saying that's easy. I mean, the example that you gave about, sometimes sentences that somebody tells you when you're a child, they got really imprinted
Mm.
in your mind. And it takes a really long time to understand that they're there to start with, and then managing it. So I'm not, if everybody's listening and just thinks, oh my God, this is just, why can't I do it? It's difficult. You have to work at it.
Yeah. Oftentimes these things become also quite unconscious and embedded in you, don't they? So recognizing that you're running this program almost inside of you that says, oh, when this happens, then this will be the outcome, is actually really, that's the first step, recognizing that. And then second step
Yeah.
is doing something about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember reading the Chin Paradox a few years ago. And it was a really important book because he actually brings in a way that's easy to understand.
Yes.
It just tells you, oh, these are all those things that they are imprinted in your head, in your personality, and it's not your fault. And I think that's an important message. Don't blame yourself if you behave in a certain way. It's not an excuse, but recognizing that then there is something that you can do about it is important.
Mm. Yeah. The Chin Paradox is a good book like that. And for those that I'm familiar with it, it's really kind of talking about our monkey brain and our human brain, right? And what happens with the monkey brain versus the human brain. And yeah, so that's really cool. Do you have a question for my next guest?
Yes. So I'm gonna ask a question which I tend to I like to coach. And I think, in terms of success, probably is what gives me the most satisfaction because you see the change very quickly. some of the other programs, longer change programs, you don't get that. And the question that I ask is always, what would you do if you won the lottery?
Okay.
And I think I ask this question because it tends to free up the mind from constraints.
Hmm.
Is because normally, as we were referring to earlier, there are things you say, oh, I can't possibly do that.
Yeah.
Or, it's not my kind of thing, or what if,
Hmm.
things go wrong. And this kind of lottery thing mentally, it just frees you up from those constraints. And when I used it, I just come up with people saying the weirdest, things that I was not expecting. So
Yeah.
somebody in a corporate job, after a few questions, he said, I just want to be a wedding planner. I said, oh,
Right.
okay. I was not expecting it.
Mm.
But there's a trick though, because normally when you ask that question, people, they always say, I want to travel.
Yeah.
And then you say, okay, after you finish all your travels, what you want to do. So that they may give you some a bit superficial ideas, and you have to keep asking that question till you get the core of what actually drives them. What was their passion. And sometimes it's the job that they do, sometimes it's something very different.
Mm. Yeah. And I really like that question. I ask a very similar question in my coaching because often we constrain ourselves because we think, well, I can't do something different because I've got to earn this income from this job. And that's me. That's my life now is going to set on that. So if you were to win the lottery, Georgia, what would you do differently?
Yeah, after I keep traveling a little bit more, I think something that always comes to mind with this question is education,
Hmm.
especially helping other people's education. I think probably I would just go to a country where they have some challenges around girls' education, and I would just find a way of improving that
Hmm.
using my change management experience.
Right. Okay. That's a very noble cause, actually. And yeah, girls' education is a very important thing. And I'm the chairperson of a charity. So my kind of if money were no object, what would I be doing? Well, one of them is actually giving back to society. And so I'm the chairperson of a charity that promotes education, not just amongst girls, but promotes education because it can change people's realities. You know, Blue Back Foundation is there to help unleash the potential of every child. So I think you and I have got kind of similar ethos there in terms of what we'd like to do when we don't have to be working.
Yeah. Yeah, but again, it's something you can do. I mean, I haven't done it, recently, but a few years ago, I was a mentor with the Princess Trust, sort of helping, it was just older people, but, just, help somebody find their way or just understanding what their potential is just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Being of service is one of those kind of key things that really drives us, motivates us. So we're coming up to the top of our time now, Georgia. If people want to get in touch with you to find out more, what's the best way for them to do so? And yeah, email, LinkedIn, whatever. What's the best contact strategy?
Okay, so on LinkedIn, I also have a website that, funny enough, is called giorgiaprestento.com. So it's easy to find me. I do quite active online. So I have a newsletter which is Georgia on Change, where I write articles and post videos on different topics around change management. It's a day job before I get to the win the lottery. I'm a change advisor. So work with companies, with leaders to help them prevent all of those issues that may arise with their change and transformation. I feel really strongly about just the need or the importance of preventing things, and I'm doing more work recently, on the eye space as well.
Right. Okay.
So that's where to find me. And one of the things that I always encourage people to do, I have a short online assessment, which is test leaders if they are ready for change. And it just gives you customized results on, the level of readiness for change in your organization. So that something like a gift is something very useful for people to do.
Okay, that's great. Well, share the URL and we'll put that in the show notes so
Yeah,
people can click
will
through
do.
that and actually take part in that. So thank you very much for sharing your story, Georgia. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks very much for this conversation. I really enjoyed talking with you about success
Thank
and
you.
everything else in our lives.
To find your success, contact me at info@successmatterscoaching.com. That's info@successmatterscoaching.com.